We had an unexpected delay in our Friday night teachings, so you're going to have to go back in your mind now. A couple of weeks ago, and it seemed like it was a little difficult, not to everyone, but to a large number of people here, what we were talking about in our message on an introduction to the Apocrypha. I'm not going to review all that since it is on tape, and you've had enough time to review your notes and think about what we had said. But I can say that since several of you are unfamiliar with many of these items, many of these books that we're talking about, then it may be a good idea to really study your notes so that you'll at least be ready for the next teaching whenever we're going to kind of build on something that's gone before. And also maybe the 2-week delay has given some of you time to obtain a copy of the Apocrypha. If not, it'd be a good idea to get one. You don't have to have one, but we're going to be reading some out of it. We're going to be reading a lot out of one of the books tonight. So it'd be good if you've got a copy so you don't have to just sit there and listen. That way you can follow along. Now, like I said, you can either get you some Catholic Bible that you used to have whenever you used to be lost, and you can bring that, and that's going to have some of the Apocrypha, not all of it, or you can get different editions of the Bible. I think the RSV prints their own edition of the Apocrypha, or the New English Bible, or just a book from a bookstore, I said, that by itself would contain the books of the Apocrypha. Or I guess your last option would be sit beside someone who's got a copy of the Apocrypha and read along with them. But we're talking about something that's influenced, a fifth of the world's population, because a fifth of the world's population is in the Roman Catholic Church. And so it's important that we know, and a lot, I said before, a lot that is in the Roman Catholic Church is not in the Bible, but it is in the Apocrypha. That's exactly where they got some of their teachings. Superstitions was right out of the Apocrypha. At least that's where their foundation is, and they run to other verses in the canonical scriptures and say, well, see, this is just saying what the other parts of the Bible have to say. And what they mean by that is what the Apocrypha said is being reduplicated now over here in the canonical scriptures. Now, we were going to look at the books in a certain order according to 4 categories. I'll start by repeating that, and then we'll get into what we want to talk about, because we're going to finish up. Remember last time, 2 weeks ago, we didn't get through with an introduction to the Apocrypha, so we're going to finish that tonight before we start one of the individual books. We said we're going to look at 4 categories into which we've divided the, remember, anywhere from 14 to 18 books, depending on how you count them, of the Apocrypha. We're going to stay with the number 14 because it's easier and it's more prevalent. And the 4 categories according to their literary nature and according to their composition, their makeup. We said A, we're going to look at the historical books of the Apocrypha, which contains 1st Esdras and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. You need to be getting familiar along the way with these names. Obviously, they're strange if you haven't been in a church that used books like these before, because in all of the years you did your daily Bible reading, you never came across any of these names in your Bible because they weren't there. Then B, books of religious fiction. This is the largest group as far as the number of books. Tobit, Judith, that's a male and a female's name. The rest of Esther, or additions to Esther. The Song of the Three Holy Children. Many of the books have 1 or 2 or 3 or more names that the book can go by. The Song of the Three Holy Children, which also has the Prayer of Azariah. The History of Susanna, or the Story of Susanna. And the History of Bel and the Dragon, or the History of the Destruction. Because that's what happens to old Bel and the Dragon. They get destroyed by Daniel the prophet. So Bel and the Dragon, or just Bel and Dragon, to shorten it. And from what I can remember, you can look on your outline and back me up by this. I think this is the order that we've got on the outline. I think this is the order we're going to be studying the books. I didn't look. I'm glad that it's true. Then C, wisdom books. And the two chief wisdom books would be Ecclesiasticus. Then another one under wisdom would be the Wisdom of Solomon. We know he's wise. The Wisdom of Solomon. And for lack of a better place, I stuck two other books under wisdom, Baruch and the Prayer of Manasses. We'll go ahead and call him Manasses since we're talking about Greek writings. Really his name was Manasseh. It ended with an H in the Old Testament, not with an S. But we're not calling the first book there on your list, First Ezra, the Hebrew name. We're calling him by his Greek name, Esdras, because that's what it's known by. So we'll go ahead and talk about Manasses instead of Manasseh. So we've got there under wisdom. And some people will say that Baruch and the Prayer of Manasses are really not wisdom writings. And that's kind of true, but neither are they historical. Neither are they religious fiction. Neither will they fit under the fourth category. So rather than invent a fifth one, you put them under wisdom. And there are some similarities because of the prayers that are prayed. And then the final category would be apocalyptic books. And that would have only one, Second Esdras, which, remember, is only one of these not in the Septuagint. The Septuagint has 13 out of the 14. It doesn't have Second Esdras. So you see, going back up to the historical section, that First and Second Maccabees will be studied together. We've got two groups of books that are First and Second. The other would be First and Second Esdras, but notice they're separated as far as they can be. First Esdras will be the first book we study, and Second Esdras will be the last one that we study, just because they fit under two of the different categories. First Esdras under the historical category, and Second Esdras under the apocalyptic one. Okay, I'm going to give you, next of all, now this starts new things tonight, the arrangement of the Apocrypha in the LXX. And we're going to come back now and say a lot more about the inclusion of the Apocrypha in the LXX, because a lot of false ideas, a lot of false doctrines based upon the fact that the LXX, which was the Jews' and the Christians' Bible for a period of time, contains the Apocrypha. But you've got to remember that we've got copies of the LXX that don't date back any earlier than, say, the 4th century A.D. And that's 6 centuries, 600 years after the Torah, the Pentateuch, was translated. And it's at least 5 centuries after the rest of the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek. And so who's to say, and many people are out there who will fill this slot, who's to say that back there 100 BC all of these apocryphal books were scattered throughout the LXX? We can say that they weren't because some of them weren't even written at that time. But they use that as an argument for the two canon theory. There was an Alexandrian and a Palestinian canon, but we'll cover that later on. So here's the arrangement as they stand in the manuscripts of the LXX, the Septuagint version that we have today. First Esdras comes right before Ezra. That would only make sense. You can have first Esdras, then Ezra, then Nehemiah, then Esther. The books of Maccabees come after the prophets. On rare occasions you can find a third and a fourth Maccabees. I think there's even a fifth one in some other language, like the Arabic language or something, but that hardly ever comes into play. And neither do the third and fourth books of Maccabees. Although they come according to their contents and when they were supposed to have been written before the time of first Maccabees. So Maccabees would come after the prophets. Judith and Tobit, those books are very, very similar. They deal with very fanciful religious fictional ideas. So they go together. Judith and Tobit follow the book of Esther. So they'd come in our Bible between Esther and the book of Job. So you'd have first Esdras, then Ezra, then Nehemiah, then Esther, then Judith and Tobit, then Job. Okay, additions. We've got four books that we're going to call books of addition. Let me explain that for those of you that don't know, so you'll know what I'm talking about as we go along later on. We have them separated in our 14-book classification into 4 entirely distinct and separate books. You're not going to find it that way in many different Bibles. You won't find it that way in Old Catholic Bibles. They're not separated like that. So let me tell you what the additions are. First of all, we have what we call the additions, or the rest, R-E-S-T, of Esther, which means our book of Esther is incomplete. Now notice that if I say the rest, you don't know whether it's singular or plural additions. If I say additions, right away you know it's plural. You could speak of the rest of Esther, or the additions to Esther, as being either one addition or as many as 6 additions, or additions I should say. We're going to call it 1 because, and you'll understand this more whenever we get to the rest of Esther, because what it amounts to are a number of different segments of apocryphal material that's just been inserted sporadically throughout the book of Esther. It's not segments of material that deal with different distinct ideas that make a whole complete story in themselves, like we're going to see with the book of Daniel, the additions to the book of Daniel. Esther is just a few verses here, a few segments there, slipping in the name of God here and slipping in another religious idea here and there, just spread on at least 6 occasions throughout the book of Esther. So it's known as the rest of Esther, or the additions. You can see how it could be plural. Or you can sum all of those singular 6 additions up, just put them together and say this is the one addition that's been made in the apocryphal books to the book of Esther, which is more or less what we're going to do. So there's one book of additions. Then the other 3 are found with regard to Daniel. The 3 additions to Daniel. Now, so you see, some of you didn't know this, some of you did. The 3 additions to the book of Daniel are the Song of the 3 Holy Children, as well as the prayer of Azariah. That we're going to put those together. We're just going to call it the Song of the 3 Holy Children, the history of Susanna, and the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon. Now you see, we're going to count those as 3 books. Now remember, a book doesn't have to be 500 pages for it to be a book. Just look at 2 John, look at 3 John, look at Obadiah, look at Jude. Sometimes they can be very short. Now these are very, very short. We're still going to count them, though, as an entire book, although in many editions, such as the Catholic Bible, you're not going to find those separated. You're going to find them all together with the canonical book. Obviously, you're going to find it that way. That adds more believability to what you're trying to get across, the material you're trying to slip into the Scriptures. And so the prayer of Azariah, as well as the Song of the 3 Holy Children, comes between the 23rd and the 24th verse of Daniel chapter 3. So you see, that's why we call it an addition to the book of Daniel. And in the Catholic Bibles and other Bibles, we're not just speaking of that, you'll find it between Daniel 3:23 and Daniel 3:24. There's a whole section of material where you say, what's it about? It's this prayer that Azariah prays, and it's a song the 3 holy children sing while they're in the furnace after Nebuchadnezzar has thrown them in. And it's stuck between the 23rd and the 24th verse of our canonical book of Daniel in his 3rd chapter. So there you see that that's an addition to the book of Daniel. Then in the second place, the history of Susanna is chapter 13. All we have are 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. The history of Susanna would be chapter 13. And the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon would be chapter 14. So in other words, the apocryphal book of Daniel would have our 12 chapters as well as 2 additional ones, 13 about Susanna and 14 about Bel and dragon. And then it also would have a whole interpolation between verses 23 and 24 of chapter 3, which makes the book of Daniel quite a bit longer than our book of Daniel. So that's where it's also found, by the way, in the Septuagint. They're found in the same places there. So we call those 4 books or segments, whatever you want to call them, the additions to the book of Esther and the additions to the book of Daniel. Okay, moving along with the LXX arrangement, we have Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus. right after the wisdom books in our Old Testament. Which would be after what book? The Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon. So wisdom would be the next book after the Song, and then Ecclesiasticus would be the next book after wisdom. What would be the next book after Ecclesiasticus? Isaiah. Okay, Baruch, where would you think Baruch would come? After Jeremiah. So we've got our 52 chapters of Jeremiah, then you've got Baruch, which is 6 chapters, or 5 if you want to count the last chapter as the Epistle of Jeremiah. Remember, we're going to put both of those together. We're not going to separate Baruch and the Epistle, and we're not going to separate the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Holy Children. So Baruch comes after Jeremiah, and the prayer of Manasseh is in an appendix to the LXX. Instead of being stuck back in Kings or Chronicles or wherever, they just add it on as an appendix. Now you're going to find pretty much the same arrangement in Catholic Bibles, in the old Latin Bibles, except Tobit and Judith precede the book of Esther instead of follow it, and the books of Maccabees come a little bit earlier. But that's no big deal because you probably got a table of contents and you can look them up yourself. Now some of these books, as we've already said, some of these books are not in the Catholic Bibles, and some of these books are not in the LXX. One's not in the LXX and 3 aren't in the Catholic Bible, but we're going to go ahead and study all 14 of them as being the 14 recognized apocryphal works. Now for the most part, Protestants and Jews don't accept, never have accepted any of these books as canonical. The Catholics, just the opposite end of the spectrum, do accept the vast majority of them, 7 according to the Catholics. It would be 11 according to us, as we'll explain later. And they call these books deuterocanonical. They don't come right out and call them these apocryphal books like Protestants do. They speak of these books that they accept beyond the strictly canonical ones as being deuterocanonical. And then what the Protestants call the pseudepigrapha, the Catholics call the apocrypha. Again, it ends up being a semantic argument over terms. And if you don't know these things, that's why I'm telling you this, if you don't know these things, then whenever you read others' writings, they're talking about something that you're not talking about when you both use the same word. That's why we gave you an explanation of the usage of the term apocrypha. Someone else can use that term and mean something different by what you mean whenever you use the term. And so you're reading in a different ballpark. If you open a book up that's written by a Catholic that says, an introduction to the Apocrypha, and you think we're really going to study about First Esdras and the prayer of Manasseh and all this. No, you're going to study the pseudepigrapha because they call things by different names. Okay, one more thing in introduction. I want to give you the title to 4 books, 4 of the best-known scholarly books that have been written on the Apocrypha, all of which you can still obtain somewhere today, even if you have to buy a used copy. The first, the best-known, the monumental, the classic until just a few years ago, is entitled The Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament. Written by R.H. Charles in 1913. The Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament, R.H. Charles, 1913. Secondly, the Apocryphal Literature by C.C. Torrey in 1945, giving you the date that the books were published. Number 3, a history of the New Testament times with an introduction to the Apocrypha. 1949, by R.H. Pfeiffer, P-H-E-I-F-F-E-R, R.H. Pfeiffer, a history of the New Testament times with an introduction to the Apocrypha. Notice there it's connected to the New Testament, not to the Old, because some people try to connect some of the statements in the Apocrypha with some of the statements in the New Testament, as well as some of the Jewish parties, like the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And then probably the best known of the recent ones would be An Introduction to the Apocrypha, 1957, by B.M. Metzger. And most of the material that you're going to find here in these three books is going to be not of the conservative persuasion. So I have to let you know ahead of time if you get any of the books or have any of them. It's going to definitely be of the liberal persuasion, the vast majority of what you're going to read. Now, the books have a lot of good information about the Apocrypha that's going to be true whether you're conservative or liberal, but all writers are known to do, whether you're conservative or liberal, they're known to, whenever they have the opportunity, slip in a point in their religious favor. You can't help but do that if you're the author of the book. So you're going to find a liberal bias in the majority of the pages in these four books. Well, that's all I see for introduction. If no one has any questions, we're going to go on and start looking at some of the books individually then.
You made a reference to the Deuterocanonical and Synopticon. You said certain people call it whatnot.
Let me go back over that again.
Yeah.
The Catholics call what we call the Apocrypha their Deuterocanonical books. And secondly, what we call the pseudepigrapha, they call the Apocrypha. So it's just a confusion of terms of Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha is what it amounts to. We're going to study the pseudepigrapha, but we're going to have to keep that entirely distinct from the Apocrypha. People talk about there being a New Testament Apocrypha, and it's true if you use that word in some of the senses that we've talked about it before, but the Apocrypha, just that name, down to this day, has come to mean these 14 books that we're going to be talking about. So we're not going to confuse the issue by studying the Apocrypha, and then later on, when we come to the pseudepigrapha, we're going to talk about these apocryphal New Testament books. It just becomes too confusing. So maybe I need to pause and say a word about that. What we're going to do will be to look at the Apocrypha, these 14 books. Then later on, once we're through with that, we're going to look at the pseudepigrapha. And the pseudepigrapha will have two divisions, the Old Testament pseudepigrapha and the New Testament pseudepigrapha. In other words, for the Old Testament days, we're going to have an Apocrypha and a pseudepigrapha that we're going to cover. For New Testament days, we're not going to have an Apocrypha. Whatever anyone else calls apocryphal New Testament books, we're going to sum all those up under pseudepigraphal New Testament books so that we don't have to keep using the word apocrypha to refer to more than one item, because it just becomes too confusing. It's going to be confusing enough, swapping around apocrypha and pseudepigrapha in the AD and BC years without adding something more that we really don't need. Well, you already know from your outline, we're going to start then with the book of 1st Esdras. We've said before it's known as 3rd Esdras in the Latin Bible because they call our Ezra 1st Esdras, our Nehemiah their 2nd Esdras, and then what we're going to refer to as 1st Esdras as their 3rd. But it's called 1st in the LXX, and it's always been called 1st in Protestant usage. Sometimes it's not Esdras, sometimes it's 1st priest, because we know that Ezra was a priest or a scribe. On rare occasions you find the book titled as 1st priest and 2nd priest, but that's very rare. Probably nobody in here even knew that, so there's no sense in telling you things you don't know. What you don't know won't hurt in some areas, as they say. Some areas, only in some. You might not know about Jesus, but that'll hurt you tremendously.
Amen.
But it won't hurt you that you don't know about 1st and 2nd priests, and just another thing to clutter your mind. Now let me make this statement about the book of 1st Esdras. It's going to be a little difficult to cover this because we're not just talking about Acts 10:38 and 1 John 4:4 and John 3:16 and Acts 2:4 and all these passages we can all quote. We're talking about things that none of us can quote from because we don't sit home reading these things, quoting, memorizing the promises out of them all the time. So it's going to be a little difficult. You're going to have to pay attention, and hopefully I can keep everything straight so you can pay attention. It becomes confusing, well, you're going to see just in trying to break down the book of 1st Esdras. But here's a statement I want to make. To remember, some of the books are known particularly for one particular thing. And we can say this about 1st Esdras, that none of the apocryphal books is as closely linked to the canon of Scripture, that is, to the Old Testament canon of Scripture, as this book, as the book of 1st Esdras. Why? Because most of the book, the vast majority of the book of 1st Esdras, is nothing but direct quotations right from our Old Testament with some minor variations. Amen. So that's going to save us a lot of time. We're not going to study. We're not going to study, by the way, any of the apocryphal books in a verse-by-verse fashion. We haven't even done that to the Word of God yet, every book verse by verse. So we'd be way off basis if we hadn't even studied the true canonical books, every one of them verse by verse, and we're already into the apocryphal verse by verse. We're going to kind of go chapter by chapter or theme by theme. But even if we were covering it particularly, we could skip over just a large section of it because it's found right in our Old Testament. In 2 Chronicles, in the book of Ezra, and in one small portion of the book of Nehemiah. Therefore, to study that would be the same as studying, let's say, the last 2 chapters of 2 Chronicles, or the first half of Nehemiah, chapter 8, or of the whole book of Ezra, because there are direct parallels between what we have in 2 Chronicles, in the book of Ezra, our book of Ezra in the canonical scriptures, as well as the last verse, I believe, of Nehemiah 7, verse 73, and the first 12 verses of Nehemiah chapter 8, which means it's going to be directly the same. Except there are some minor variations, and those variations point us away from the book because they're not in agreement with 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So, like I just said, it contains the last 2 chapters of 2 Chronicles, and I'll give you any exceptions here in a moment. It contains all of the book of Ezra. See, you probably didn't know that. 1st Esdras has all 10 chapters of our book of Ezra, just the same. So we're not going to waste a lot of time studying that, because to study that would be to study the book of Ezra. And we're not talking about Ezra, we're talking about apocryphal literature now. So we're going to stay, in other words, with these sections. There's only one. From chapter 3:1 to chapter 5 and verse 6, I believe. There's only one section here that's new. And that's the only section that we're going to read in detail and comment some on. So the last 2 chapters of 2 Chronicles, all of the book of Ezra, the first half of the 8th chapter of the book of Nehemiah. This will be what you want to get notes down on all of this, because it's just too difficult to memorize. It's too much material to memorize. So as long as you've got it in your notes, and that's really all that you need. Okay, let's say a thing or two about the author of the book. What have we said thus far about the authorship of the Apocryphal? Nothing. We don't know anything about him except one book as far as the author goes. As far as who the author was, like we can pinpoint many Old Testament books. We can specifically pinpoint many New Testament books. And it's just not true with the Apocrypha, which is one of the things that hurts its claim to canonical status. But this we can say. The author was no doubt a Jew. He probably lived in Palestine. From a verse over in chapter 5, verse 47, I think he's mentioning in chapter 5 and verse 47 particular layout of the city. He talks about a certain gate that points to a certain direction, and talks about a square and a market that's there. Evidently he knew what he was talking about, because some of these authors, they have such an Alexandrian flavor, it appears as though they resided in Egypt and not in Palestine. He was familiar with other Old Testament books, we can see, particularly with the book of Esther, and with the book of Daniel. We see this from the first 3 verses of chapter 3. I'll read these to you. Now, if you've got First Esdras along, then you need to be turning along with us. Maybe by next week, all of you will get one, so you can get involved in what's going on. So we'll be over in First Esdras chapter 3. Now, you see if you don't see a connection here. The one with the book of Esther is a lot more notable. Now, remember, do you remember what the date for Esther is? When did she live? Well, think about it. Look it up somewhere. I won't spoil the fun and tell you ahead of time. But then it's going to tell you something about this author. He couldn't have lived prior to that, or how is he making a reference right to, or looks like right to, the book of Esther? We're talking about a time just a little bit before Ezra, like around 475 B.C. Okay, here's chapter 3 and verse 1. King Darius held a great feast for all those under him, his household, the chief men of Media and Persia, the satraps, the commanders, the governors of his empire, in the 127 satrapies from India to Ethiopia. Look over in the book of Esther. Isn't this what we find here to start off with? Look at the first verse of the book of Esther. And it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. Now right away we've got a problem, because we just read that King Darius made this feast. But it's really not so much of a problem as long as you don't try to draw a connection in time between the two, because he's talking about a different time. Which Darius is he talking about? Of course, if he's talking about Darius, then we're talking about several years before Ahasuerus, which was the other name for Xerxes. He came quite a bit before. You're talking about Darius the Mede, and we're back before the time of Smerdis. You're talking about Darius Hystaspes, we're talking about after the time of Smerdis and just before the time of Xerxes. So it's going to make all the difference in the world. It came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus which reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. That's just what we read here. So there's some connection. Okay, then verse 3 of chapter 3. When they had eaten and drunk their fill, they went away, and King Darius withdrew to his bedchamber. He went to sleep, but woke up again. Well, all you got to do is read the first few chapters of the book of Daniel, and that's what Daniel's book is about. Every time Nebuchadnezzar is going to sleep, he has this series of dreams and visions. And something's going to happen here, you see, whenever King Darius goes to sleep. That's why they're getting him to sleep. People have wondered why he woke up again when it's really not time for him to wake up yet. That's been a problem right away with the book of First Esdras. So anyway, it appears that the author, we're talking about the author, knew of other Old Testament books. And there are some other allusions, but those are 2 easy ones to see. It does not appear that the author lived, however, during the Persian period. Now remember, the author more or less is claiming to be Ezra. That's how the book got its name. First Ezra is more or less claiming to be Ezra. We know that Ezra did live during the Persian period, but he makes a historical blunder of the first rank in swapping up indiscriminately the name Medes and the Persians and Persians and the Medes. And if you were living during that time, you'd never swap them up indiscriminately like that. You would keep them either the Medes and the Persians or the Persians and the Medes, as we find in our canonical books. But he swaps them up, sometimes refers to them as the Medes and the Persians, and sometimes as the Persians and the Medes. Now you might not see what we're saying, but what I'm saying is the Medes and the Persians, that means we're talking about the Persian period when this writer allegedly was giving forth this material. But with him swapping things up like that, it shows us right away that he did not live during the Persian period, which shows us right away he probably lived many centuries after that. And he's looking back just like the author to the book The Wisdom of Solomon. He's looking back in time and trying to put his material back as though it was written, let's say, the middle of the 5th century B.C. That's when the book is supposed to have been written, the middle of the 5th century B.C., because we're right during the time of the period of the Persians and the Medes. And yet because he's swapping these things up, then we've got problems with when he purports to have written the book and when he purports to have lived. If that's wrong, then what I'm saying is he's lying to us. Or he's fostering a misconception, to say the least. And since we know the Spirit of God doesn't inspire that, then he couldn't have inspired the book. Very easy to deduce the non-canonical status of many of these writings. And then some of the things we're going to say about the others, it'll be a lot more obvious in what I've just said about 1 Esdras. Okay, the chief thing we need to do is get the book divided up so that if you don't have 1 Esdras, but you do have your Old Testament with you, you can follow along. The book of 1 Esdras has 9 chapters. Now our Ezra has 10, our Nehemiah has 13, our Esther has 10, just to keep you familiar with that. It has 9 chapters. It's an incomplete book, by the way. We'll come to this whenever we get to the end, because the very last sentence of the book shows us that it's incomplete. But since I said that the book of 1 Esdras comprises the last 2 chapters of 2 Chronicles, the entire book of Ezra with the exception of 1 verse, and for the most part the first half of Nehemiah chapter 8, then I want to show you where the parallels are. So I'm going to give you, 8 points about the book of 1 Esdras on how we're going to parallel that to 2 Chronicles, to the book of Ezra, which will be the most difficult thing, and then to the first half of the 8th chapter of the book of Nehemiah. So, 1 Esdras chapter 1, we're going to give you the parallels, I'm saying, between it and our canonical books. If you don't have 1 Esdras 1, that's all right. Do you have 2 Chronicles 35 and 36? Then they're the same thing. Now, when I say the same thing, I mean in essence they're the same. There are historical mistakes. There are chronological mistakes right here in the book of 1 Esdras, multitudes of them, and they're so small we're not going to look at all of those. So when I say that it's the same, I mean that, well, let me turn. You turn to 2 Chronicles 35:1. And I'll turn to 1 Esdras chapter 1 and verse 1. Now, I don't know what yours says, but here's what mine says. Josiah kept the Passover at Jerusalem in honor of his Lord, and sacrificed Passover victims on the 14th day of the first month. The priests, duly robed in their vestments, he stationed in the temple of the Lord according to the order of daily service. He commanded the Levites who served the temple in Israel to purify themselves for the Lord, in order to place the holy ark of the Lord in the house which was built by King Solomon, son of David. Now, doesn't that read very similar to what I'm saying? All right, then. So all you've got to do is turn over to those last 2 chapters. Now, the only exception would be the last 2 verses of 2 Chronicles 36. Because as we pointed out, I think, in Old Testament introduction, those last 2 verses of 2 Chronicles 26 are duplicated in the very beginning of the book of Ezra. So, in other words, 1 Esdras has simply dropped that, since 1 Esdras contains our entire chapter 1 of the book of Ezra. There'd really be no need to duplicate the last 2 verses of 2 Chronicles 36. You have to just shout, heart attack, or praise the Lord, or help now if I've lost you somewhere along the way. So what I'm saying is, 1 Esdras chapter 1 is the same as 2 Chronicles 35 and 36, except the last 2 verses of 2 Chronicles 36. Okay, number 2. 1 Esdras chapter 2, verses 1 to 15 equals our Ezra 1. Difficult to study 1 Esdras unless you know how it's broken down like this. Okay, you can turn to Ezra 1 and verse 1. So we've just skipped all of 1 Esdras chapter 1, 58 verses, which are the same as all those verses in 2 Chronicles 35 and 36 because they're the same. So to study this would really not be studying the Apocrypha, would be studying 2 Chronicles then. Okay, here is how it goes. During the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, The Lord, in order to fulfill his word spoken through Jeremiah, moved Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his empire, which he also put into writing. Does that read like the beginning of Ezra? Then we can skip that. The third place, chapter 2 and verse 16 through the end of the chapter, verse 30. Now here's where it really gets confusing, and here's where the author's made his mistakes, which I think we'll point out whenever we come back, if we've got time. Corresponds with Ezra 4, 7 to 24. See, now that would really throw you for a loop, because he's going right in order: 2 Chronicles 35, 2 Chronicles 36, Ezra 1, but now he doesn't have Ezra 2. He's got to first of all introduce this man Zerubbabel as being known by that name before he can give us Ezra 2, because I think it's the second verse of Ezra 2 who introduces Zerubbabel by that name. And since first Esdras hasn't introduced him yet, then he feels that'd be invalid to introduce him or to start telling the story about him without giving us his name to begin with. Okay, in the fourth place, chapter 3 and verse 1 through chapter 5 and verse 6 is the most important section of First Esdras. That's what we're going to spend some time looking at. This is the only original part of the book. By original, I mean it's not a duplication of Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So we're talking about 2 whole chapters, all of chapter 3, all of chapter 4, the first 6 verses of chapter 5, or what constitute what we might call the original germ of the book. That's all of First Esdras, is 3:1 through 5:6. Until he wanted to spice everything up and draw some other material out of the Bible to get what he was thinking that he had, which was a chronological framework, which he made a serious blunder, which we'll point out whenever we come back if we have time. Okay, then in the fifth place, we have chapter 5 and verse 7 through the last verse of that chapter, which is 73. It's a long chapter. Now we've got to go back and pick up the early portions of Ezra. See, we skipped from 1 to 4. So now we're going to go back and pick up everything in between that, with one exception. One verse, the last verse of what we would be picking up in its entirety, which would give us Ezra 2:1 through Ezra 4:5. Then I'm going to break this down into 3 sections to show you where the chapters of Ezra's book are found. So 5:7 through 73 equals Ezra 2:1 through 4:5. So what do we have there? We've got Ezra chapter 2, we've got Ezra chapter 3, we've got the first 5 verses of Ezra chapter 4. So that's what I want to correspond now. So this will be several points under the 5th one that I've just given you. 5:7 through 46 is Ezra chapter 2, the whole chapter. And you remember how long Ezra 2 is. Look at that. We're talking about 70 verses now in Ezra 2. It's a long chapter. And he does it this way so that he can do what he wants to with this man Zerubbabel, which is what the whole story and the whole book of First Esdras is about. Then we've got verse 47 through verse 65, all of chapter 5, which equals Ezra 3. Then we've got verse 66 to the end of the chapter, 73, which would equal Ezra 4, verses 1 to 5. Then we've got verse 66 to the end of the chapter, 73, which would equal Ezra 4, verses 1 to 5. Okay, the 6th place, Esdras 6:1 through 7:15. So we're talking about 2 chapters now, because I think verse 15 is the end of chapter 7. Chapter 7 of First Esdras, I believe, is the short chapter. We'll see whenever we get there. 6:1 through 7:15 equals Ezra 5:1 through 6:22. So we're talking about a couple of chapters there. That is in the book of Ezra, chapter 5 and chapter 6. So let me give you 2 points under number 6 to show you where Ezra 5 and 6 are found. First Ezra 6, 1 through 22 equals Ezra 5. And then 6:23 through 7:15 equals Ezra chapter 6. Then in the 7th place, we've got 1 Esdras 8:1 through 9:36. Equals Ezra 7:1 through 10:44. How far does that take us in Ezra? All the way. It takes us to the end of the book. So I'm going to give you 4 points under this. We've got to get chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10 out of the book of Ezra to correspond to some of these verses between chapter 8 and verse 1 and chapter 9 and verse 36 in the book of 1 Esdras. So 8:1 through 27 corresponds to Ezra 7. 8:28 through 67 corresponds to Ezra 8. 8:68 through 90 corresponds to Ezra 9. And 8:91 through 9:36 corresponds to Ezra 10. Now that only gives us number 8, one more point to go. And here we've got the last chapter, second half of it in 1 Esdras, 9:37 through 55. 9:37 through 9:55. And what does that correspond to? Okay, only thing we hadn't done yet is Nehemiah. Really what he did, he took the last verse of Nehemiah 7, which is verse 73. So really it's from Nehemiah 7:73 through Nehemiah 8 and verse 12. Again, it's a mystery why he's stuck on verse 73, because when you go back up to, say, verse 69 or verse 70, we're talking about a whole segment in the end of this long 7th chapter of the book of Nehemiah. Why take the last one? Nobody knows. Now, we left out, see how you're following that maze, we left out one verse in the book of Ezra. There's only one verse in the whole book.
What's verse 6?
Verse 6 of what? Of chapter 4. It's a very interesting verse. He probably left it out for a reason. That's where he got really messed up, is when he got around, well, anywhere from Ezra 4:6 to Ezra 4:24. Verse 24, I believe, is the end of Ezra 4, the last verse of the chapter, especially when you get to verses 23 and 24. He was running into some problems. So the only verse of Ezra that's not in 1 Esdras is Ezra 4 and verse 6. Now, I told you earlier that 1 Esdras ends incompletely. It ends right in the middle of a sentence. So it's been hypothesized, it's more than a hypothesis, we don't have the whole book. It's never been found down to this day. The rest of the book has not been found. So, since you might not have 1 Esdras, therefore you would have the 9th chapter and the 55th verse, then you can turn over to what? Nehemiah 8 and verse 12. Turn over to Nehemiah 8 and verse 12. Some of you are following along. I know it's difficult. It's a whole maze. But now if you've got 1 Esdras, you can read it and know what it's corresponding to. You see how difficult it is to piece all that together. It's very difficult. I better turn over there. I don't remember exactly what it says. I don't know if it's the 12th verse or did he start the 13th one.
13.
Okay, he's starting the 13th. We've got verse 12. You look at verse 12 and I'll read towards the end of 1 Esdras. So they all departed to eat and drink and make merry, and to send shares to those who had none, and to hold a great celebration, because the teaching given them had been instilled into their mind. That's in essence what verse 12 is saying. Then verse 13. Now on the second day were gathered together of the chief fathers of all the people, the priests, the Levites, unto Ezra the scribe, even to understand the words of the law. Well, there's the first phrase, and on the second day were gathered together the chief of the fathers. Well, here's the last thing in 1 Esdras, they gathered together, period. Now, of course, that could be the end of the book. You could think, well, he's just talking about this final grouping here. But when you look there at that 13th verse of Nehemiah 8, you know that what the book originally had was verse 13, probably verse 14. We don't know how much more of the book of Nehemiah. Maybe even got real bold and went back and got Ezra 4:6 and put it in his book. Probably not, but he at least probably had some more of the book of Nehemiah. Which doesn't matter to us because we've got the book of Nehemiah. We don't need the extra material added on there. All we need is chapter 3, 1 through chapter 5 and verse 6. Now he never mentions Nehemiah by name, which is obviously one of the mistakes of his book, since Nehemiah does mention himself by name. Now Nehemiah really couldn't be mentioned in the book of Ezra because remember Ezra, we're dating around 458 BC and Nehemiah around 445. And Nehemiah's book does have Ezra, but Ezra's book couldn't have Nehemiah because it came before. But when you get over to Nehemiah, chapter 8, now we're talking about Ezra and Nehemiah living at the same time in Jerusalem. And verse 9 of Nehemiah 8 mentions Nehemiah, the governor, the Tirshatha by name. Whenever you read around verse 50 of 1 Esdras 9, it says the governor did such and such, but it doesn't mention Nehemiah by name. So that's another curious omission in the book of 1 Esdras. Okay, concerning the date of the book. It was written around 100 BC. And probably it was written in the Hebrew language and later translated into the Greek. Josephus knew about the book, and he even knew about the Greek copy of the book. And he preferred it over our canonical Ezra. The only reason that it appears why he did prefer it is perhaps because of the Greek style of the book of 1 Esdras as compared to the Septuagint Greek translation of our canonical Hebrew Ezra would be a little better. That's another curious item about the book is Josephus knew about the Greek copy of 1 Esdras, as well as the Greek copy of Ezra, because he knew about the LXX. And why did he prefer Esdras over Ezra? Because although they are the same book, like I said before, there are many discrepancies between the two books where our Ezra is right and their 1 Esdras is wrong. But the Greek style, it must have been done by a different translator, in other words. The Greek style is better than the LXX Greek copy of the Hebrew Old Testament book Ezra, and perhaps it's been suggested, perhaps that's why Josephus preferred it. Like I said, it has many internal inconsistencies. It doesn't totally agree with Ezra. I can point out one thing in particular. The sacred vessels of the Lord's temple are said to be all brought back on all three of the exilic returns. You couldn't bring all of them back on each time. Each time you're returning, you can only bring part of them back. So let me give you some verses. Chapter 2 and verse 12. They're bringing all of the Lord's temple vessels back. That's one. Remember, there are three exiles, or there are three returns of the exiles. Under Zerubbabel, then under Ezra, then under Nehemiah. You're supposed to know that from Old Testament introduction. So chapter 2, verse 12. Chapter 4, verses 44 and 57, which would be a second return, which would be a second time all the vessels were brought back. He's not even consistent with himself, in other words. And then chapter 8 and verse 60, a third time the exiles return. Remember, if you know the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, then you know about the three returns of the exiles. Then we've got them bringing back the vessels again. Okay, the next thing I want to do is go over to chapter 3, for those of you that have it, verse 1. Now you won't have this. This is, remember, is the only section that's original. So if you don't remember anything that I've said thus far, remember what we're going to called The Tale of the Three Guardsmen. That's what the whole book is about. The rest of it you can forget about. You've already got it in your Bible. I was just trying to help you out. But chapter 3:1 through chapter 5:6 is known as the story of the tale of the three guardsmen. It's very famous in history. A lot of sayings have come from this about the power of truth and the power of wine and the power of beautiful women. And so I'm going to read some of these verses to you. Now I've already read the first 3 verses. Talks about King Darius here. So you see, he's purporting that he's living around the middle of the 5th century B.C. We just said before that really the book dates around 100 B.C. Quite a bit after when he claimed that it was. So after Darius is given this great feast, and we have already read how he went into his bedchamber and he went to sleep, but he woke up again. And I said it really wasn't time for him to wake up because he's going to get up later on, and that was the right time to get up. Now all of this is not in your Bible. And by the way, there are Persian legends, Persian tales that date a lot earlier than 1st Esdras when it was written that give a very similar account about this tale of the three guardsmen. It doesn't have to be guardsmen, but it concerns an argument between 3 people over what's the strongest thing in the world. That's found right in Persian legends and tales, which shows that this has been incorporated into 1st Esdras right from Persian lore and legend. So what this is about, the tale of the three guardsmen, we're going to have 3 bodyguards of King Darius. Maybe I better give you a little history before I go into reading it. We're going to have 3 bodyguards of King Darius, and they're going to have a little contest among themselves. And the question that they're all trying to answer is, what is the strongest thing in the world? Now, the book doesn't tell us this, but evidently this is what we're supposed to gather from it, that whoever can answer with the best answer, then King Darius is going to reward. Now, King Darius does reward the one who gives the best answer with a lot of gifts, but we're never told until later on after the story is over that this is what Darius did. How did the 3 guardsmen, in other words, know that King Darius would reward them? Well, they wouldn't have known, and we wouldn't know, unless what the writer expects us to do is just assume these things. So they're going to pick 3 things. One of them picks wine, one of them picks kings, and one of them picks women. And then they argue over which is the strongest thing in the world. So that's what it's about. It's a very, very interesting tale. So that's why I'm going to read a large section of it here. Looks like we're going to go a little longer than I meant to, but I'm going to read a large section of it, so if you don't have 1st Esdras, it'll be on tape and you'll be familiar with this story. Maybe you've even heard it in other connections outside of the book of 1st Esdras, because it's a famous story. Okay, here we go, verse 4. So you can pretend like you're going to sleep, and here's your nursery rhymes. Then the 3 young men of the king's, it's a good story, it could put you to sleep. Then the 3 young men of the king's personal bodyguards said to each other, "Let each one of us name the thing which he judges the strongest. And to the one whose opinion seems wisest to King Darius, then he will give rich gifts and prizes to him. He will be clothed in purple, drink from gold vessels, sleep on a golden bed. He'll have a chariot and all of these other things and so forth. His wisdom shall give him the right to sit next to Darius and to be given the title kinsman of Darius." Then each wrote down his own statement and sealed it and put it under the king's pillow. When the king wakes again, they said, the writing will be given him. The king and the 3 chief men of Persia shall judge whose statement is wisest, and the award will be made on the merits of the written statement. So here's what one wrote. Wine is strongest. The second one wrote, the king is strongest. The third one wrote, women are strongest, but truth conquers all. When the king got up, he was presented with what they had written. He read it and summoned all the chief men of Persia and Media, the satraps, commanders, governors, chief officers. Then he took his seat, and they're all gathered together, and he says to call the young men and let them expound these statements unto us. So here's the story of the first one. Here's his speech. The first, who spoke about the strength of wine, began. "Sirs," he said, "how true it is that wine is strongest. It sends astray the wits of all who drink it. king and orphan, slave and free, rich and poor, it has the same effect on them all. You see, this is tremendous wisdom of these Persians. This is found in lores and legends of ancient Persia. Wine, you can't be a king and drink wine and it not affect you like a pauper. It'll affect you the same way. In other words, it has total dominion over mankind. It can make anyone pass out in a stupor sooner or later. Doesn't matter who you are. Very, very interesting thought. It turns all thoughts to revelry and mirth. It brings forgetfulness of grief and debt. It makes all feel rich, cares nothing for king or satrap, and makes men always talk in millions. When they are in their cups, they forget to be friendly to friends and to relations, and are quick to draw their swords. When they have recovered from their wine, they cannot remember what they've done. Sirs, is not wine the strongest, seeing that it forces men to behave in this way, and with this he ended. So there's the argument of the first one. He says that wine can make you act like it wants to make you act. That's true. Then the second one, who spoke of the strength of the king, began his speech. Sirs, is not man the strongest, man who masters the earth and the sea and all that is in them? But the strongest of men is the king. He is their Lord and master, and they obey all his commands. If he bids them make war upon one another, they do it. If he dispatches them against his enemies, they march and level mountains and walls and towers. You think of the power of a king has. He just says go, and they go. And whole countries fall because of the one word spoken by a king, by a monarch. They kill and are killed. You die for your country. You die for your king. They do not disobey the king's orders. If they are victorious, they bring everything to the king, their spoils and everything else. Or take those who do not serve as soldier or go to war, but work the land. They sow and reap, and they bring their produce to the king. They compel each other to bring him their tribute. Though he is no more than one man, if he orders them to kill, then they kill. If he orders them to release, they release. He orders them to attack, they attack. To lay waste, they lay waste. To build, they build. To cut down, they cut down. To plant, they plant. So all his people and his troops obey him. Besides this, while he himself sits at table, eats and drinks, and goes to sleep, they stand in attendance round about him, and none can leave and see to his own affairs. They never disobey him in anything. Sirs, of course the king must be strongest when he commands such obedience, so he stopped speaking. You've probably heard this before. The three strongest things in the world. The third who spoke about women and truth, and this was Zerubbabel. So he's trying to get Zerubbabel into the picture is what he's trying to do. And he mentions this is the only one of the men mentioned by name. And this is the same Zerubbabel, purportedly, as the one in our Bible. And he's going to win this contest just like Daniel did. It's a lot like the book of Daniel. He's going to win a contest here and get some favors from the king bestowed upon him and his people. And he said, Sirs, it's true that the king's great, men are many and wine is strong, but who rules over all of them? Who is the sovereign power? Women, surely. The king and all his people who rule land and sea, they were born of women. They couldn't have gotten here without women, in other words. And from them they came. Women brought up the men who planted the vineyards which yielded the wine that they took to the king. You trace it back. Women are the strongest. Women. A lot of statements have been taken about women. The glory and the rank of women from this passage here. They make clothes for men. They bring honor to men. Men cannot do without women. If they have amassed gold and silver and all kinds of beautiful things, and then see a woman with a lovely face and a figure, they leave all these things to gape and stare at her with an open mouth. And all choose her in preference to gold or silver or beautiful things. You know, he's saying you can have all this gold and silver piled up around you. When you see a woman walk by, where's your eyes? It's not on that gold and silver, it's on that woman. So that shows what's strongest. And it can take the eyes of a king just like the eyes of a pauper. A man will desert his father who brought him up, and desert even his country, and become one with his wife. He forgets father, mother, and country, and stays with his wife to the end of his days. Here is the proof that women are your masters. Do you not toil and sweat and then bring all you earn and give it to your wives? Man's out there laboring away and he comes home and he gives the wife the money, gives her the paycheck. She just rules him, in other words. She just stays home, puts her leg up on the couch and relaxes. He brings all the money home, buys her anything that she wants. She doesn't have to do anything but just be a woman. Well, can't you might not have heard of this, but can't you tell some statements have been taken right out of this? Some people in ERA must have got a hold of this. Oh, it's a beautiful piece. You know, you can't deny that it's a beautiful piece of ancient literature. It's just not inspired scripture. A man will take his sword and sally forth to plunder and rob. You know, these are all these perils that men have to go through. They'll sail on the sea and the river. They'll face lions and travel in the dark. And when he's finished robbing and plundering, he'll bring the spoil back to home to his beloved. A man loves his wife more than his father or mother. For women's sakes, many men have been driven out of their minds. Many have been sold into slavery. Many have died or come to grief or ruined their lives. Do you believe me now? Certainly the king wields great authority. No country dare lift a finger against him. Yet I watched this Apamie, his favorite concubine, talking about Darius, daughter of this famous Barticus. She was sitting on the king's right. She took the diadem off his head and put it on her own and slapped his face with her left hand. The king only gazed at her open mouthed. You know, that's the typical American male. You don't dare say anything. When she laughed at him, then, you know, he laughed. He laughed at himself. When she was cross with him, he coaxed her to make up with him. Sirs, if women do as well as this, how can their strength be denied? And then here's a little parenthetical insertion. The king and the chief men looked at one another. They know what they're hearing is true. So Zerubbabel went on, Sirs, we have seen that women are strong. The earth is vast. The sky is lofty. The sun is swift in his course, for he moves through the circle of the sky and speeds home in a single day. How great is he who does all this! But truth, too, is great and stronger than all else. The whole earth calls on truth. The sky praises her. All created things shake and tremble. With her there is no injustice. There is injustice in wine, in kings, in women, in all men, and in all their works, and so forth. There is no truth in them. They shall perish in their injustice. But truth abides and is strong forever. She lives and rules forever and ever. With her there is no favoritism or partiality. She chooses to do justice rather than what is unjust and evil. All approve her works. In her judgments there is no injustice. Hers are strength and royalty, the authority and majesty of all ages. Praise be to the God of truth. So what he ends by saying, what he wanted first of all is to show him, he's going to come to his point about truth. In other words, what he says is the greatest of all things is truth. Truth is even greater than women, is what he says. But why he mentions women first is to show them that without getting in some far-off philosophical or spiritual area, namely truth, he can find something right here on the earth in their own confines that's stronger than both wine and kings, which is why he talks so long about women. But what he wants to get to is this subject about truth, that truth is the greatest because it endures forever. So he ended his speech, and all the people shouted and said, and you might want to get this down because it's a quote you'll find in, well, I've seen it in writings myself, that you'll find in different writings. Great is truth, truth is strongest. This is what the people shout. Great is truth, truth is strongest. So it's a tremendous praise of the virtues of truth. Above wine, above the strongest of men, kings, and above the strongest of all beings, women. Truth is above that. Amen. And so as the account goes throughout the rest of chapter 4, they agree that Zerubbabel, with his praise of truth and his prelude of women, has given forth the best answer of what's strongest in the world today. And as a result, he is given the right to ask whatever he desires. Now, before I go into that anymore, let's go back to our little outline. Let me see if I can make that comment I wanted to make earlier, to show you why he's done what he's done. There's a purpose for all of these books, and we'll give you that as we go along, and I'll give you the chief purpose for the book of Esdras here in a moment. But let me give you two preliminary things concerning the purpose of the book. It's not the purpose of the book, but there's no better place to put these things I want to say than under preliminary considerations for the purpose of the book of 1st Esdras. The first place, he wants to praise Zerubbabel. There's no doubt about that. That this man has a particular attachment to the Old Testament figure Zerubbabel. And he's wanting to praise him. Because remember, of the three bodyguards, only one does he give us their name, and that is Zerubbabel. He doesn't name the first one or the second one. And in the second place, it seems like he wants to set forth in perfectly correct chronological order the history of the exiles. Now, he does go back pretty far in advance when he goes back to Josiah there in 2 Chronicles 35:1. He really didn't need to go back that far, but he was trying to give us a little bit of the history of the end of the kingdom of Judah so we could talk about the Babylonian captivity, so we could talk about Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years, so he could finally get to what he wanted to talk about, and that was the return of the exiles. And what he's wanted to do is give us in perfectly correct chronological order a history of the exiles. Yet I want to show you, and it's obvious this is what he's trying to do. Look how he split the book. Look on your list now that I've given you. And look how he split the book of Ezra up in so many different sections. Why not just take the book of Ezra just like it was? Because he didn't feel like the book of Ezra was in chronological order. Now he gives us this original germ of the book, the tale of the three guardsmen, from chapter 3 and verse 1 to chapter 5 and verse 6, because he wants to introduce this man Zerubbabel. And he doesn't give us Ezra chapter 2 until after he's given us this section, because Zerubbabel doesn't appear in Ezra by that name until Ezra 2 and verse 2. So that's one reason that he's gotten. In other words, look how he went from 2 Chronicles 35, 36, Ezra 1, and you have to skip down 3 more points to get to Ezra 2. It's because Ezra 2:2 mentions Zerubbabel. And he hasn't even introduced the fellow yet. He wants to give us a praise of his great ideas about truth before he can bring him into the story. And so what he does, he puts Ezra 4:7 through 24 back in its place. And this is where he's made a chronological blunder of the first order. And I want to show you why, and I doubt anyone here could correct it either. I believe I said, whenever we studied some about the book of Ezra, that it is extremely difficult to understand the book of Ezra, and I said that chapter 4 would be chief among the chapters of Ezra. To put, not only to put, but I could say just to understand what Ezra is talking about in Ezra 4. Now, if you don't believe it, you go home and try to get it figured out. Because, let me just quickly review something for you. You don't have to get all this down. But let's say that the first 4 verses, we're in Ezra 4. So you've got your Bible, Ezra 4. The first 4 verses, we're going to be talking around 536 BC. Because we're talking about the time of Cyrus. Okay, look in verse 5. Remember, he gives us 2:1 through 4:5 in another section, as set apart from 4:7 to 24. He hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus. Okay, we're talking about 536 BC. From Cyrus down to the reign of Darius. Now, he happens to be talking about Hystaspes here, king of Persia, so we're talking about 520 BC. Thus, verse 5 constitutes a 16-year period, from 536 to 520 BC. Okay, now look at verse 6. I said this is the only verse that he left out. and in the reign of Ahasuerus. Now, who's Ahasuerus in the Bible? Xerxes. And where's Xerxes found in the Bible? Esther, the book of Esther. When are we talking about there? Around 480 BC. So we've gone from 420 now to 480, or around 487 or 86 BC. And then look at the next verse, and in the days of Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes. Now, Artaxerxes comes after Xerxes. It's not the same as Ahasuerus. And not only that, then we get down to verse 10, and we're talking about Asnapper, or he's also known as Ashurbanipal. Now we're talking about the middle of the 7th century BC. But then what throws everybody for a loop would be the last two verses. And this is what evidently really confused the writer of 1st Esdras. You see, Ezra's not in chronological order. Chapter 4 is certainly not in order. And Esdras, the writer of it, must have recognized that, but in trying to put it in order, then he shows the mistake of his own mind about these past Persian kings. We see that when we get down here in verse 23. Well, you see, what we have to start back with verse 7. You see, he did include, correctly, verses 7 through 24 as a section together. You see back in verse 7, we're talking about Artaxerxes. And even in verse 11, then here's the letter to Artaxerxes. So we're talking about the same king throughout that section until you get there to verse 10 that I mentioned. But then when you get to verse 23, now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai the scribe and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem unto the Jews and made them cease by force and power. Now, it's getting off the subject, but that may imply more than what Ezra said whenever it said that they made them to cease by force and power. But then look at verse 24. Then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, so it ceased unto the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now you might not be following along, but let me help you along then. If verse 24 comes right after verse 23, and the second sentence in verse 24 says, so it ceased, and then we can read the rest of that, it means that it ceased from some time to some time. You see, that's what it means. Okay, it ceased from when? Artaxerxes. It ceased from Artaxerxes because that's what verse 23 says. It ceased from Artaxerxes to the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. What's the problem with that? Darius, the Persian, came long before King Artaxerxes. You'd have to have it reversed and say that it ceased from Darius to Artaxerxes, not from Artaxerxes to Darius. And so evidently what the writer of 1st Esdras thought was that Ezra was mixed up here. And you may think that too. In the last two verses, in telling us that King Artaxerxes came before King Darius, when he didn't. He came after him. And so that's why he grabs this chapter 4, verses 7 to 24, and sticks it in another section. He tries to get it earlier. If you go back to the third point that I gave you, he's already got chapter 4. Because he's thinking that we've got a mix-up here between when Artaxerxes lived as compared to when Darius, the king of Persia, lived. And I admit, it's difficult. And we're not going to get into some of the answers because they're difficult and detailed. But Ezra chapter 4 is a very difficult passage. Some people even question the inspiration of the book because of the last two verses that tell us, I mean, look at verses 23 and 24 very plainly. It says that once Artaxerxes had this letter read, then he sent some people and made them stop on the temple, and they stopped from that day until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. You can't get around that fact. And yet Artaxerxes came after Darius, not before him. So what I'm talking about concerning 1st Esdras would be preliminary considerations for the purpose of the book. One of the preliminary considerations would be that he's trying to straighten out the mix-up chronologically in the book of Ezra, particularly in Ezra chapter 4, and more specifically the last two verses, by trying to get this section earlier in his book than we find it in the book of Ezra. it still doesn't help, because if you leave verse 24 after verse 23, you've still got Darius coming after Artaxerxes. You're going to have to switch those verses around, which he doesn't, by the way. But here's the chief purpose for the book. We're going to give you, for the most part, purposes of the books to let you know why they were written. Here's the purpose. It was to secure the kindly treatment of the Jews by her present foreign rulers around 100 BC, which would be the Ptolemies. And you'll see this whenever I go back now to the tale of the three guardsmen and read what Zerubbabel asked from King Darius. It was to secure kindly treatment of the Jews by her present foreign rulers. Remember, she got kind treatment during the time of Ezra, whenever the king was besieged. She got kind treatment during the time of Zerubbabel. She especially got kind treatment during the time of Nehemiah, whenever Nehemiah came before the king and interceded. She even got kind treatment during the time of Esther, whenever Esther's ideas prevailed over those of Haman. And so it's just following in line with that. Although we're not living during the time of the Persians now, we're living 100 BC during the times of the Ptolemies. And yet he's trying to write a book hoping that it'll get in the hands of the leaders, the Ptolemaic leaders, so that the same thing will be produced with regard to Israel as was done in Ezra, as was done in Nehemiah, as was done in the book of Esther. So I'm going back now to 1 Esdras 4:43. Then Zerubbabel said to the king has asked him, remember, he's won the contest about women and truth, and now he can have what he wants. And here's what he says: remember the vow you made on the day when you came to the throne. You promised to rebuild Jerusalem and to send back all the vessels taken from it with Cyrus set aside. Well, that's already been done hundreds of years before when this book is written. When he vowed to destroy Babylon, he also vowed to restore these vessels. And you too made a vow to build the temple which the Edomites burnt when Judea was ravaged by the Chaldeans. This is the favor that I now beg of you, my Lord King. This is the magnanimity I request, that you should perform the vow which you have made to the King of Heaven. So King Darius stands up, kisses him, writes letters to the governors who are controlling Palestine, and tells them to let him come in and give them cedar from Lebanon and build the temple at Jerusalem. Then we get down to verse 58. When the young man Zerubbabel went out, he turned his face toward Jerusalem and looked up to heaven and praised the King of Heaven and said, from thee comes victory, from thee comes wisdom. Thine is the glory, and I am thy servant. All praise to thee who hast given me wisdom. To thee I give thanks, O Lord of our fathers. And so he took letters and he set off and goes and tells his fellow Jews. They praise God that they're going to be able to rebuild the city, rebuild the temple, and they have a feast for a week with music and rejoicing. So it's obvious that the purpose is to get the same, to solicit the same type of response from the current Ptolemaic leaders, as was done at these early times. Okay, I think we're going to stop there with the book then. Had a few more things, but I didn't know we'd go that long on 1 Esdras. Because that's a short book. All we're talking about would be 2 chapters, 3 and 4. But I said that it would be a little difficult because not everyone's familiar with all of these details and all of this material. If you've got the books, obviously you can be reading them in advance, but it still doesn't mean you understand the book, though. It really won't help a whole lot. Because you could have read, not known all these details that I just gave you about 1 Esdras, you could have read the whole book. I guess it'd be better to go back and read now chapters 3 and 4 and the first 6 verses of chapter 5, so you're a little more familiar with the tale of the 3 guardsmen. Although that's hard to forget. That's such a picturesque story. You don't even have to try to memorize that. You know about wine and kings and women and the truth, so it just makes sense that someone's going to put into writing what is the experience of people out in the world for ages and ages and ages. the strength of wine and kings and women, and then finally we've got truth, which is the strength above all.